works for me. So. No, it's still in there. No, it's still plugged right here. Yep. I mainly just have my scriptures up there. Do I need to plan on just going no PowerPoint?
Yeah, that's mine. You remember that. And then he was here one Sunday. My daughter, his wife, and this is their daughter, my granddaughter. Google Bill. Near Austin. You know.
Good place. Welcome.
Good. There we are. Gracias. Yes. Well, good morning. We're having a little bit of fun with technology. Evidently, they pushed an update through, and it was still doing its updating thing, and took a while for everything to kind of come together there. But thank you, Charlie and crew, for getting us going here. So anyway, happy Easter. Glad you're here. Hope you have some plans today for something fun. I always tell Tammy this story before she and I were dating in college. There's one week and my family had already moved out of state, and so I stayed at college for Easter weekend, and so I went to church that morning, came back to the dorm, and my car coincidentally was in the shop because it had some major issue going on, and so I was like, I'll just walk and find something to eat for lunch today. And so it turned into kind of like basically about a 2-mile walk to find something open, which was Taco Bell. So that was the Easter that I had Taco Bell for my Easter lunch that day. So not that I don't still go to Taco Bell, mind you, but hopefully you've got better lunch plans than Taco Bell today. So anyway, with that. So we're in Romans today. We're going to be talking about Abraham in the law. Let's talk just a second about where we were last week. That's kind of rolling right in here to chapter 4. And so after Paul's, you look at Romans, they kind of got the first several verses where he's made an introduction and he's talking, and then he kind of starts getting into his argument, and he's starting to build an argument or a case through these first 3 chapters that everybody has sinned and that no one is righteous. And so he's shared a lot of different examples. He's come from a lot of different angles in that. And last week we noted in chapter 3, we started in verse 21, that we saw kind of a shift. So he's been building this case all the way up to 3:21, and then that particular verse starts, but now. And so we see a little bit of shift in what is emphasis. And he goes on to say that there's nobody. It doesn't matter if you're a Jew, if you're a Gentile. Nobody can claim righteousness on their own. But he says, but God's made a way. There is a way, though, that can get you into the right relationship with God. It's not through the law, but it's going to be apart from it in a way that's consistent with everything that the scriptures have been telling us. And so he's trying to point this out, and he's making this argument. And so he restates that universal problem again, that everybody has sinned and continues to fall short. And then he shows the solution is equally clear, that God declares people righteous, not because they earn it, not because we've done anything or worked for it or something that God owes us, but he gives it to us as a gift that's grounded in what Jesus did for us at the cross. And he also goes on to say that at the cross, that's where God's justice is fully satisfied. And so, you remember we talked a little bit about boasting, and there's no room for boasting. And so all this means there's no room for boasting because nobody can stand before God on the basis of their performance. It's faith, not works. That's the way to righteousness. And because there's one God, then that means there's one way of salvation for everybody. And so that's been kind of our lead up from last week. And so now as we move into chapter 4, Paul turns to Abraham. And he's going to show that justification by faith and not by works he's going to use Abraham as an example of that. And he's going to also show that Abraham is showing us that this has always been how God works, that this has always been part of God's plan, it's always been part of God's design, that righteousness has always come through faith. So with that, let's get into the first few verses here. What shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, discovered in this matter? If, in fact, Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So Paul starts with Abraham. As you think about that, any thoughts on why Paul might choose Abraham as his example for this? Who was Abraham to the Jews? He's the father of the Jews, the Jewish nation. If you kind of talked about, who are some of the, I don't know if this is the right way to describe it, but, who are some of the most important names in the Jewish culture and the Jewish history to the Jewish nation, you would certainly probably land on Abraham as maybe your first one that you would come to. You might think Abraham, Moses, you might think David, but certainly Abraham was one of that. So if you were Jewish, if you were a Jew, and you're listening to Paul at this time, you would regard Abraham as the great founder of the Jewish nation. And so when Paul's talking about Abraham, he's talking about a person, he's talking about ground that everybody that's Jewish would understand. Once he says Abraham, they all kind of get it. They know everything about Abraham. He's very central to their faith, to everything they do. So you've got that. Paul's also looking to prove that what makes a person right with God is not the performance of the works that are laid out in the law, but trust and completely yielding to God. And if you were Jewish, this would seem very, very different. It's like, oh, that's something new. We've not heard that before. That's not something that we've done. But what Paul's trying to do here is he's going to use Abraham to show it's really not new. This is really what the Scripture's been talking about, been pointing to all these years. So really this whole thought that I'm sharing with you as Paul is not anything new. It's as old as the Jewish faith itself. And when he uses Abraham, Abraham's kind of a way for him to put flesh on the idea of faith. It probably feels like a very abstract concept to his audience. If you're Jewish, again, You're used to the works that the law required of you, the different sacrifices, the different observances, those types of things. So how do I truly understand what this concept of faith is? Abraham's going to help him do that. Abraham's someone he can point to. We can point to some things in his life and some of the things that God says about Abraham, and this will help make this more real for them. They'll be able to see faith in action. And we think about what we know about Abraham. God came to Abraham, and he asked him to leave his home, leave his family, leave his friends, leave his livelihood, and trust him. And God said, if you do that, you trust me, I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to bless all people on the earth through you. And so we ask, why would Paul use Abraham as an example to this audience? It's because of these things. This would be something that they could relate to. This would be very impactful. This would help him make the point he's trying to make. As a reference point, we see like Hebrews 11:8, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. And I think is one of the things we're going to see throughout all these different things we learn about Abraham, or we review about Abraham today, is that just you kind of marvel at his faith when you pause and think about what it took on his part to be able to do this, to leave all of this and to follow God and to do these things. And he doesn't even know where he's going. God hasn't said we're going here. He's just said, I'll show you where we're going. And so we look at that. So why does Paul use the example of Abraham? By appealing to maybe what we might say Abraham is the supreme patriarch of Israel. Paul's making the point that the gospel of grace is not a new thing, but it's really the ultimate fulfillment of God's original plan. We talked a little bit about this last week. You remember the first people that were converts to Christianity were Jews. And last week we talked about how they were so tied to the Mosaic law that it was a slow process for them to break away from it. It wasn't easy for them. And we gave some examples. We talked about the Ebionites, kind of a sect that broke off that kept holding to the Jewish law. Talked about how we needed the conversion of Cornelius to convince Jews it was okay for Gentiles to receive the gospel, that they were intended to be recipients of this as well. It wasn't just for the Jews. We talked about the early Christians in Jerusalem teaching that Gentile Christians had to be circumcised and keep the law or they couldn't be saved. And so we see that the Jewish people in general have had a hard time trying to grasp this whole concept of grace and where it goes, and that God has made this available to all people, including the Gentiles. It's not just them anymore. And it's interesting, if you look at a lot of Paul's writings, he tends to emphasize the point of righteousness by faith and not by works. For the Judaizing Christians in several of his letters, you can see some of the same type of thought in 2 Corinthians and Ephesians and Colossians and Galatians, and of course here in Romans. So Paul seems to make a big point of this, or he seems to keep using this same theme, this same point he keeps trying to make. Because I imagine in that time, in that context, this was a very big struggle, that he was running into this in a lot of different places where the Jews and the Jewish Christians were struggling how to adapt and how to move away from the Mosaic law. So if we look a little bit closer at these three verses, let's look at Abraham. We would consider him to be the father of the Jewish nation, chosen by God, the one we look to as the pillar of faith and righteousness. And Paul knows that as he's writing this and using Abraham, and says, so what did Abraham discover in the matter of faith versus works? And he says, well, if Abraham was justified by works, and we know from some of the stuff we talked about last week, that's a pretty big if, because that's a very high standard. It's a standard of perfection. But if Abraham was justified by works, then he had something to boast about, but not before God. If Abraham was considered righteous because of his works, he would have something to boast or brag about, even though it would not put him anywhere near God. And so Paul, again, is laying out this argument. And what he's doing is he's given us a contrast of two approaches to righteousness. One that's based on what people do and can take credit for, versus one that depends on faith, which you can't brag about, but you can merely just accept with thanks and gratitude. Remember, Abraham himself wasn't perfect. So we're talking about Abraham and Abraham being justified. But Abraham wasn't a perfect man. He did a lot of good things. He did a lot of right things. But think about some of the stories that we know about Abraham. He lied a couple of times about Sarah being his sister. He'd get in these situations where he feared for his life. And rather than say that, Sarah was his wife, he would lie and say that Sarah was his sister. God had told Abraham that, through his lineage, he would make him a great nation, that people of the earth would be blessed. But it was taking a long time. And so Abraham and Sarah, they get impatient, and Sarah suggests, hey, why don't you take my handmaid Hagar, and I'll give her to you, and we'll have a child, and that'll keep the lineage going. We'll do that type of thing. When God's talking to him again about having a baby, and he's an older man and Sarah's an older woman, he's laughing when God tells him that he's going to give him a son by Sarah. And so we see these things, and again, was Abraham perfect? Did Abraham keep the law perfect? We can see he didn't. But God counted him as righteous. So we see that it wasn't a matter of perfection. If it had to be perfection, if it was perfection by obeying the law to be counted righteous, Abraham would be in trouble because he couldn't do it. None of us could do that. That quote that we're talking about, Paul quotes Genesis 15:6, where it talks about Abraham's belief in God was credited to him as righteousness. We're going to talk some more about the timing, but it's interesting because Abraham was declared righteous roughly 400 years before the law was given through Moses. So we remember in our chronology that Abraham is before the time of Moses and the giving of the law and stuff. Abraham is one of the patriarchs. And yet he's declared righteous before there's even a law of Moses to consider. So righteousness can't depend on keeping the law because there was no law for Abraham to keep at that time. Abraham was also declared righteous before he was circumcised. And so we also see that righteousness is not dependent on keeping the different little rituals of the law. And what we see here is that Abraham entered into a right relationship with God, not because he did all kinds of legal works, but because he entrusted himself just as he was on the promise of God. Fully trusting in God, what God says, where God was trying to take him, what God was trying to do with him, what God was trying to work through him. Abraham is fully trusted in that. Let's move on to verse 4. Now to the one who works, wages are not credited as a gift, but as an obligation. However, to the one who does not work, but trusts God who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness. David says the same thing when he speaks of the blessedness of the one to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never count against them. So he starts verse 4 in kind of a general principle. Probably a lot of us can relate to. When we have a job, we get paid. And that paycheck is not some gift from your employer. That paycheck is what you're owed. The employer has a debt to you. You've done work for the employer. There's been an agreement of what you'll be compensated, what your wages will be, and then you get paid. And so Paul is trying to make a distinction here about the difference between works and between faith. And so he starts with an example that we can relate to. Things like, so we don't, trying to kind of get us to understand, we don't earn righteousness like we earn a paycheck. It's not something we can earn, that we can merit, that we can do these 7 steps and you're declared righteous. That's not how this works. If righteousness was achieved by works, it'd be a debt that God owes us and not a free gift of grace. But if you think about that, God's not in debt to anybody. God doesn't owe anybody anything. And Paul's already made the point that none of us can earn being declared righteous by God, no matter how hard we try. So we know that God owes us nothing. So this is not like a job. This is not like where we're owed something for work that we have done. This is righteousness is a gift from God. In verse 5, Paul goes on to show the difference of being declared righteous as a gift as opposed to as a payment for services rendered to God. He's just shown us that if we could be justified before God by works, then God would owe us righteousness. But now Paul points to the opposite of earning something by work. He talks about receiving this as a gift. So this is not a person that he's talking about who's trying to earn a gift. They simply believe in God who justifies the ungodly. That's how he describes it. It's their faith that causes them to be declared righteous by God. It's interesting here that Paul, as he's describing God, says God who justifies the ungodly. And if you think about that, that's really at the heart or the core of the gospel itself. The good news that God doesn't wait for us to become godly. He doesn't wait for us to go through a checklist and say, okay, now you're godly and I can declare you righteous. Or he doesn't wait for or we can't be righteous on our own apart from him before we're welcomed into the family of God. The good news is that he justifies us in spite of our sinfulness, and that's why this is such a great gift. Then in verse 6, Paul references David as a lead-in to, he's going to quote from Psalm 32, the first two verses. We talked about, why would Paul refer to Abraham and kind of the standing, the stature he had among the Jewish people? And now he's also gone back, and now he's going to bring David into this. And again, David, another big figure to the Jewish nation, to Jewish history. They would think of King David. He was a hero of the nation of Israel. A lot of times people would refer to the reign of King David as kind of the golden age of Israel. And so he's used Abraham to start this example. He's going to kind of slip David in here before we go back to Abraham again and keep talking about Abraham. But he references David. David also speaks of those God credits as righteous apart from works. So again, here's kind of the same thought that he's been talking about. And he quotes from Psalm 32. And again, if you were Jewish, this would be another passage that's familiar to you. You know these verses. You've heard these verses. This isn't anything new. It's like, oh, I didn't know that was there. Is it? No, you know these verses. But what Paul's trying to do is saying, let's look at some of the stuff you already know. Let's talk about some of the people you already know. And I'm going to try to show you how they've been saying this really all along. Maybe we didn't recognize it, but let's think about this and talk about the difference between faith and works. Another familiar passage, Psalm 32, helps Paul reinforce the idea that Scripture is always pointed to faith, not good works or deeds, as the path to being declared righteous by God as a gift to those who believe. So David says those whose transgressions are forgiven. In some of your translations, it may say be your lawless deeds, your lawless acts. It may say disobedience. Those whose sins are covered are blessed. So they've received a good thing, a gift of grace, forgiveness that hasn't been earned by good works. And God's decision to not count the sins of which we are guilty against us as a gift of his grace. I think we recognize that. God declares us to be righteous based on our faith in him, not on our inadequate works. And so at this point in his letter to the Romans, Paul has used both Abraham and David to demonstrate that the person being forgiven and declared righteous has earned nothing and has been given everything. So again, we see where he's trying to go. We know the argument he's trying to make, and he's been making it really since part of chapter 1 leading up to this, and now he's appealing to two figures in a passage of Scripture that the Jewish audience would be very familiar with. Verse 9. Is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? We've been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. And he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then, he is the father of all who believe but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness may be credited to them. And he is then also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but who also follow in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. So a lot of talk we're getting into now about circumcised and uncircumcised. And in this context, I think we understand that when he's talking about the circumcised, he's talking about the Jewish people, the Israelites. The uncircumcised would be the Gentiles. And so he's bringing both of these in here. If you were a Jew, there was a special significance, a special importance that was attached to circumcision. In their culture, a man who was not circumcised was quite literally not a Jew. Even if by parentage or by lineage, he technically was a Jew. In their culture, if you were uncircumcised, you were not a Jew. There was not an exception to that. And so he asked these questions, is this great blessing of being forgiven for our sin only for the Jews, God's chosen people, or is the blessing of the forgiveness of sins available for all people, even the uncircumcised Gentiles? And so Paul poses that question out there. He doesn't necessarily answer it directly, but the implication, as we read here, is that it's available to both Jews and Gentiles. And so Paul says, hey, we've been talking about Abraham's faith being credited to him as righteousness. So let's look at the subject of circumcision, and let's look at some of the timing. How did this lay out in history? So he says, so was Abraham credited as righteous before or after he was circumcised? So he's kind of asking the question, okay, if this is all dependent on the law, then Abraham, in following the law, should have been circumcised, right? But was Abraham credited as righteous? If he was this before the law, after the law, before circumcision, after circumcision? Where does this fall? And he answers the question for us, well, before. And obviously, we can read the history too. We know it was before. Some scholars believe that God declared Abraham righteous at least 13 years before he was circumcised. And that's just kind of walking us back through some of the timeline of when he took Ishmael and when God commanded and how old Ishmael was, and some of the places where it talks about how old Abraham was at different points in life. And so we can see just even by doing the math that there's at least 13 years between the time God said Abraham is righteous versus when he was circumcised. So what's Paul's point? His point is that circumcision had nothing to do with him being declared righteous by God for his faith. So what is there to exclude the uncircumcised non-Jewish world from being justified by God through faith in Christ Jesus? If we go back again to the culture, if circumcision was seen by them as something very important, if a person was not even considered a Jew and in context, in favored by God, in relationship with God, if that's kind of the culture, and he's saying, well, hey, if you look at this, Abraham was considered righteous by God way before he was circumcised. So if that's the case for Abraham, isn't that true for everybody? Even the non-circumcised, the Gentiles? So he's trying to broaden this thought process. He talks about that a little bit more. He says that Abraham's circumcision was a sign that served as a seal, an outward sign of the righteousness he had by faith before circumcision. And so making kind of the point here first that circumcision was not the gateway to the right relationship with God. It was only the sign and seal that a man had already entered into that relationship. And so we come back to the timing piece. As a result of the timing, in other words, being declared righteous before he was circumcised, he starts talking about the relationship, kind of keeps talking about the Father, and you go back to the promises of God where he said, make you the father of a great nation, the earth that's going to be blessed through you, and those things. Because of the timing of that, Abraham becomes the father of both the Jews and the believing Gentiles who would follow. So Abraham, father to all who believe God without being circumcised, telling us non-Jewish people can follow Abraham's example of being declared righteous before God through faith and not because of works. So again, Paul is making his argument, and he's laying out the timeline and trying to make his point. But again, if you're Jewish in this context, This is really going against everything you've known and practiced. You're really probably struggling with this. And that's probably why Paul is emphasizing this so much and why he's using so many examples to try and say, look, I can even show you the people that you revere in Jewish history. And let's look at some of the things in their life and what went on, and let's look at the timing. And I'm going to prove to you that this is not really a new concept. This has been going on. This is what Scripture was leading to, was this. In verse 12, Paul goes on to show that Abraham's faith in God's declaration that he is righteous because of it caused him to become the spiritual father of all believers in God, both Gentile and Jewish. And so Paul says that Abraham is the father of the circumcised, but he redefines that in a spiritual sense. So we know in a physical sense that Abraham is physically the father of all Jewish people because they all came through his lineage. We know that part. He's their primary ancestor. They're all his descendants. But Paul, when he's talking about this, he kind of narrows that down a little bit and says, a spiritual child of Abraham is not only circumcised and Jewish, but also those who walk in the footsteps of Abraham and have the same faith in God that Abraham did before he was circumcised. So in other words, Abraham became the spiritual father of both the believing non-Jews and the believing Jews. And that's kind of the key there, is he's saying he's the spiritual father of the circumcised who believe like Abraham believed, who had that same kind of faith. So he took a kind of a bigger group of everybody who's circumcised, and he's narrowed it a little bit and said, it's not necessarily everybody, it's those in this group of circumcised who also believe like Abraham believed. He's also their spiritual father, as well as the spiritual father of the non-circumcised who believe as well. And so he's given us a few parameters there of what that means. "13. It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. For if those who depend on the law are heirs, faith means nothing and the promise is worthless, because the law brings wrath, and where there is no law, there is no transgression." So Abraham's relationship with God didn't begin with the law. We've covered that a couple different times because his relationship started way before the law was even put into place. But it started with a command from God and a set of promises that God gave to him. God told him to leave his country and to go to another land. God promised to make him a great nation, to bless him, to make his name great, to bless the families of the earth through him. So did Abraham believe God? Did Abraham have faith? We know the answer to that is yes. We see in Genesis 12:4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. You know, if you pause there for just a second and think about that, we don't know a lot about Abraham before God called him, but if we know by kind of where he was from and some of the things going on in the land, we can probably look at Abraham and say Abraham was probably a heathen, a pagan, before all of this. And just to think about the faith that God speaks to him, tells him to do these things, doesn't exactly tell him where everything's going to go, and he listens and he follows and he goes through and keeps coming back to that verse, and Paul quotes it several times. It's because of that faith, that's why Abraham was credited as righteous, because he believed all those things, he did those things. His faith was unwavering. He continued in spite of circumstances around him that looked different, looked like, oh, there's no way this is ever going to happen. But Abraham never gave up his belief. God made those promises to Abraham centuries before he gave the law to Moses. So we can see again, those promises had nothing to do with the giving of or keeping of the law. Again, everything from the timing standpoint was way before the law was in existence. They were given through the righteousness of Abraham's faith. It's because of Abraham's righteousness, because of his faithfulness, that God made those promises. So Paul, again, we think about all the stuff he's been kind of laying out for us. He's already shown that nobody can keep the law because all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. And so he starts making the argument, he said, so if God's promises are only for those who are able to follow and keep the law, then those promises are never going to happen. Those are empty promises because we already know nobody can keep the law, that nobody's perfect, that we all fall short. So we've based a promise on a condition that can't be met. So he's, again, using his counter argument to say, well, if that's the case, if these promises were contingent on people keeping the law, well then those promises are just never going to happen because nobody's going to be able to keep the law perfectly enough to earn those promises. When law is a requirement for salvation, then faith serves no purpose. If it's all about keeping the rules, if it's all about checking the boxes, then faith doesn't really matter. It's really just a matter of checking the boxes, and that's what he's trying to contrast for people here. Because really what the law does, any law does, is it reveals sin, and it can't deliver the promises of God since nobody can keep the law. And he goes on to talk about this a little bit. The law brings God's wrath. And he's not talking about wrath like, God's angry and an emotional thing. He's talking about God's opposition to sin, that God cannot tolerate sin. So it says, the law brings God's wrath and judgment for human sin for law breaking. Paul says, without the law, there is no transgression. Nobody can break a law that doesn't exist or doesn't apply to them. Even without the law, though, sin still exists. Even if there's not a law, doesn't mean sin's still not there. We just don't recognize it as something wrong or as a transgression because there's no code, there's nothing formal to say you can't do this. But that doesn't mean behavior can't still be sin, even if there isn't a law. The law doesn't produce righteousness as it produces accountability. It puts an individual under judgment, which is why the promise of the promise must rest on grace, not the law. (16) Therefore the promise comes by faith so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who have the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our father in the sight of God in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. In verse 16, Paul is again saying some of the same things he's already said. He's just kind of put more of a positive perspective on it this time. He's been talking about God's promise to Abraham and his descendants and says that receiving the promised inheritance depends on faith, not on following the law. You're probably getting tired of me saying that. He says it a lot here. Paul's been making the case that since Abraham was declared righteous by God for believing God, everyone who comes to God by faith is Abraham's offspring, including both Jews and Gentiles who believe in God. And in that way, Abraham is the father of all believers. And so we see kind of what he's getting at when he talks about he's the father of us all. He then goes on to describe God as the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. Giving life to the dead, and there could be a couple things he's mentioning. It could be a reference to Sarah and Abraham themselves. Oh, Tessie?
The lesson reminds me so much of Hebrews chapter 11, the home of faith.
Yep.
And it has so many examples of how Abraham moved by faith. God told him to do things he didn't question. He just went ahead and was obedient. And it also describes, how God told Abraham to give up his only son and how he moved for that. So the lesson reminds me so much of the hall of faith.
Yeah, for sure. If you couldn't hear the comment, we're talking about Hebrews 11 and what we kind of commonly call the hall of faith and all the examples of the different people from the scripture that talks about their faith. And there's a significant chunk of that talks about Abraham and his faith and some of the same things that's mentioned here, and goes on to mention the faith he had to be willing to offer up Isaac and those types of things. So definitely a good section to remind us of these same things. Giving life to the dead. So there's it could be in a couple different things. He's talking about everything coming through Abraham and his lineage, and we know that he and Sarah were pretty old by the time they got there, and they use some interesting. I think they're like Abraham was around 100 and Sarah was 90 when they finally got pregnant. And the promise was fulfilled to give them a son. The way they describe themselves. Sarah's womb is described as being dead. Paul talks about Abraham and says he was as good as dead. It could be a reference to something along those lines specifically to them. It could be, he could be talking more in the sense of the resurrection of the dead. And this God bringing to life the dead in the sense of the resurrection from the dead, kind of referencing more of what we might say the gospel news, the good message there. Calls into being things that were not. Again, that could be a reference maybe to Abraham and Sarah's promised child and that the nations would come through them. If you think about it, he's talking about nations that didn't exist when he made that promise. There wasn't an Israelite nation when God made that promise to him, but through Abraham, that nation and multiple other nations came about. So it could be a reference to that. That nations that had never been would come into existence, including Israel. It could be a reference to God as creator of the universe who brought things into existence that weren't there before. We've got we're not going to get through all of 4, obviously, but if we look here at 18 through 22 real quick. Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed and so became the father of many nations, just as it had been said to him, so shall your offspring be. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. This is why it was credited to him as righteousness. We look at a couple of things. One of the things God had told Abraham and that he believed is that he and Sarah would have a son. And from a purely human perspective, that probably didn't make a lot of sense. You're looking at how old they were and the different things going on, how their bodies were described. From a human sense, it probably didn't make sense, but from a godly perspective, certainly God is more than capable of doing that. And Abraham believed that. Abraham's faith didn't waver. That's why it was credited to him as righteousness. And we are right at the end time here. There's just a little bit left, and then I just probably kind of sum this up by saying Abraham is such a great example of faith. I think he's very challenging for us today when you think about the circumstances and the environment and the context of what was going on in his life and his faithfulness and the fact that he didn't waver and that, while he may not have understood it, he figured somehow God's going to figure out how to do this. This will be accomplished because I believe in this promise that God has given to me. I think it's a very challenging example, one that I won't speak for everybody. I'll say I probably fall short of this in many ways. And we should all strive to have a faith like that. And then again, Paul is using him as an example, appealing to the Jewish people, to his Jewish audience there, and kind of saying, again, I want you to understand that you can't be justified through your works. You can only be justified through faith and the plan that God has laid out for this to happen by. So anyway, that is all we'll be able to cover today. Jack, I think, are you on next week? Yes. Jack will be next week, and we will go from there. So thank you for your attention.